Good afternoon, and a warm welcome to our first online event of the Global Learning Hub for Transitional Justice and Reconciliation. We are looking forward to our discussions, and I hand over to Andrew Gilmour, who is the Executive Director of the Berghof Foundation.
Thank you so much, Natasha, and a very big welcome to everybody today. And as Natasha said, this is our first in a series of dialogue events on the Global Learning Hub for Transitional Justice and Reconciliation. And the Hub is a joint initiative of the Berghof Foundation and the German Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, known as BMZ. We're celebrating at Berghof our 50th anniversary, and when we did our new strategic plan, we decided that focusing on dealing with the past and reconciliation should be one of our major strategic focus areas for the years to come. And on that, we're building on at least 2 decades of work that we've done on transition mechanisms in the Balkans, on the facilitation of dialogues on memory and history in some countries of the Caucasus, and on the integration of transitional justice mechanisms in political processes such as national dialogues in various places in East Africa and elsewhere. And I think it's clear to all of us that transitional justice will play a role at some point, and we all hope sooner rather than later, in the horror of what's going on in Ukraine at the moment. We at Berghof contributed to the German government's inter-ministerial strategy to support dealing with the past and reconciliation, and which provided the policy framework for Germany's engagement in this increasingly important field. And this strategy links transitional justice with peace building and sustainable development, which really is a huge step forward. Now, I came to Berghof from a human rights background at the United Nations, and I'm constantly trying to find ways to bridge the gaps. And 2 weeks ago, we had a rather important meeting here, a public meeting on human rights and mediation. But this is another bridge in our views, and we are convinced that transitional justice is not only a key component of promoting sustainable peace, but it also bridges that gap with human rights and on human rights approaches to development and peace building. And so, hence, the Global Learning Hub builds bridges in a number of ways between German institutions on the one hand and organizations from the Global South, but also between policy, research, and practice, and also between different fields of expertise. For us, the Hub represents a joint endeavor in partnership with German and international actors to advance what we are convinced is the sort of transformative potential of this field for transitional justice in the light of current global challenges. I'm absolutely thrilled by actually the group of people we have to speak with you today, Bleeker, Habib, Nassar, and Pablo de Greiff, and arguably is the world's leading expert on this topic. And I very vividly remember my first meeting with him back in 2016. I was thrilled by it, and I later heard that I embarrassed my human rights colleagues by clearly having rather limited understanding of what transitional justice was. But I hope I've slightly rectified that knowledge gap in the intervening 6 years. Maybe not all my colleagues would agree with that. But in any case, it is a great pleasure to have all of you here with us today, including our colleague from BMZ. Thank you. Over to you.
Okay, pleasure for me to be here. Thank you very much. I'm very much welcoming you to this Transforming Transitional Justice Conference, and sorry for being late. It's a bit busy today, and I'm very glad to be here in sad times, I have to say. The Russian aggression against Ukraine marks, of course, a turning point, not only for the European, but also for the international peace and security architecture. And no wonder we call it a so-called Zeitenwende. It forces us, of course, this Zeitenwende to examine and to rethink and adapt the ways in which we engage in cooperation with our partners in the framework of our foreign defense and development policy. And at the same time, the global consequences of the current crisis on food and energy security worldwide and its repercussions for other ongoing conflicts and war in other parts of the world reinforce the importance of Germany's active engagement for crisis prevention and peace building. And it is crucial that we approach the current and future challenges from the perspective of how our engagement can contribute to the prevention of future crises and promote peaceful transformation. For example, we take a look at one of Germany's priority areas in development cooperation, supporting just transition. Addressing and also mitigating the consequences of climate change not only requires us to consider questions of social justice between current and future generations, between winners on the one side and losers of necessary technological innovations in the energy sector, etc. We also have to understand how these processes affect ongoing conflicts triggered by climate change in order to prevent further escalation. We must consider also patterns of exclusion and historical grievances of different groups whose socio-economic marginalization may be exacerbated both by climate change and measures to mitigate its effects in order to promote peaceful and transformation process. Therefore, my ministry, the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, is committed to continue supporting implementation of the federal government's guidelines, preventing crises, resolving conflicts, building peace from 2017, which formed the conceptual basis for further development of strategies dealing also with security sector reform, good governance, and of course, dealing with the past and reconciliation. And the interministerial strategy to support dealing with the past and reconciliation has been developed in close consultation and collaboration with civil society organizations, research and international institutions, and many of you joining us today and have been involved in the process. And thank you very much from my side for that. And well, the strategy built on experiences from the Global South as well as from Germany. And it highlights also the importance of linking processes of dealing with the violent past with an explicit prevention agenda, strengthening gender equality, empowering the participation of affected groups and communities in these processes, as well as promoting collaboration, knowledge generation, and of course, mutual learning. This joint learning dialogue and collaboration with European and international partners seems more relevant than ever at the moment in history when long-held certainties about peaceful coexistence and an anti-totalitarian consensus are being challenged, if not completely shattered. And it is in this spirit of partnership and mutual learning that BMZ and the Berghof Foundation took the initiative to establish the Global Learning Hub for Transitional Justice and Reconciliation. And for us, thank you very much again. The Berghof Foundation is a welcome partner with its proven record of facilitating global learning and participatory research with partners in Germany, as well as the Global South, having made notable contributions to the conceptualizations of dealing with the past. And at the same time, it has many practical experiences in supporting dialogue and peace building around the world. And therefore, I wish you a fruitful discussion, looking forward to further debate on lots of learning, global learning, mutual learning in the coming years. And I hand over to Natasha Zupan, and say, hello, Natasha, nice to see you again. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Jochen, and thank you, Andrew, especially also for framing, and situating the hub within the policy landscape in Germany and probably also the international discourse. So again, from my side, a very warm welcome to all of you. It's really a pleasure to have so many people joining us and also our guest speakers today and this afternoon. As already mentioned, I'm Natascha Zupan, and together with my colleagues, Johanna Loba and Matthias Auer, we have prepared this first dialogue event of the Global Learning Hub for Transitional Justice and Reconciliation. Linking transitional justice and reconciliation, as we intend to do, is probably giving us a first hint that transitional justice has gone a long way in the last decades. So back in the early 90s of the last century, thinking and practice of transitional justice very much focused on democratic transitions, not the least in Eastern Europe and Germany, but also in South America. But since then, of course, the landscape has changed quite dramatically. So moving from post-authoritarian settings to post-conflict settings, and it's, as we already heard, it's about to change again. So today we would like to take you on a journey to the future of transitional justice with our speakers, Bleeker, Pablo de Greiff, and Habib Nassar. And as the hub really wants to integrate German dealing with the past experiences, we also invited Anna Kaminski, who is the director of the Federal Foundation for the Study of the Communist Dictatorship in Eastern Germany. But unfortunately, she's sick and can't join us today. So we get started now. All our panelists have been actively involved in dealing with the past transitional justice processes, influencing thinking and practice of transitional justice. So I would like to look back, at least for a moment, and take stock. So looking to Pablo, who is the director of the Transitional Justice Program at New York University, Pablo held various policy and research positions. Amongst them, he was the first UN Special Rapporteur. I'm just cutting the long title short of transitional justice. And he's also currently member of the UN Independent Inquiry Commission, International Commission of Inquiry for the Ukraine. So Pablo, from your research perspective, but also with regard to the UN and policy discourse, what has changed in the last years with regard to transitional justice?
So if you take the long view, I think that a lot, and I would like to start by mentioning some successes that the field has had to illustrate the change. I think that the transitional justice achieved in a relatively short period of time very significant normative change at the international level. And I think that the conference that gathers us today is a good reflection of this. And of course, I take the opportunity to thank all of you for the invitation. But this is an international conference. It is part of the effort to gather knowledge and experience. And that suggests that, in fact, there is a lot that has happened. 30 years ago, the rights to truth, justice, reparations, and guarantees of non-recurrence were notional rights. And I think that what transitional justice managed to do was twofold. First, to make them a reality for many, many people in different contexts, both doctrinally and in practice. So it was not just a question of normative change in the sense of modifying texts. It was normative change also in the sense of modifying practice. So the expectation is that countries that undergo different types of transitions today, and Natasha has already mentioned early on, it was transitions from authoritarianism to democracy, now increasingly transitions from conflict to peace. But the international expectation is that those rights will be respected and that they will be satisfied, which of course doesn't mean that in all cases they are, even less to the extent that they should. But the point is that the expectation is that it will be there. And again, the point to stress is that this isn't simply a textual doctrinal change, but that transitional justice has been in practice illustrating how to operationalize these rights in the domain of justice, for example, by teaching, giving lessons about how to overcome or how to mitigate the consequences of amnesties, how to solve questions about the retroactive application of law, and how to overcome obstacles posed by statutes of limitation. In the domain of truth, by the establishment of different instruments, including truth commissions, which perhaps is the instrument with which transitional justice is most identified. But not only that, commissions of inquiry are also truth-seeking mechanisms. In the domain of reparations, that was a field that had a long history in the sense of interstate reparations, but not so much in the area of intrastate reparations. And it was transitional justice that taught people how to establish large-scale administrative programs and guarantees of non-recurrence, to which I would like to come back in a later intervention, because it was mentioned in the sense of prevention repeatedly in the introduction, and I think it has a lot to do with the future of transitional justice. Transitional justice also contributed to making this a visible concept as part of an integrated transitional justice policy. So in fact, a lot has changed. I will stop here, but I think that we have made some progress.
Thank you, Pablo. Mo Bleeker has served at the Swiss Federal Ministry of Foreign Affairs as a special envoy for dealing with the past and atrocity prevention. And basically, she has been involved in shaping the mandate of the UN Special Rapporteur for Transitional Justice. So listening to Pablo, especially when it comes to, normative changes, but also changes in reality, what did you think? What kind of changes did you envision with regard to the mandate? And also, what kind of changes have you been observing in the last couple of years?
Thank you, Natasha. Thank you, Pablo. Nice to see you again. And I'm very pleased to be here. I see that there are more than 70 participants also, so that's great, a nice conversation. And after the excellent presentation of Pablo that was insisting on the normative elements also, among others, I thought I will come back to the initial thinking we had when I was working in the Foreign Ministry as Special Envoy, when we decided to launch a resolution in the Human Rights Council to create a mandate for a special rapporteur, and you were the first ones, and we are soon heading towards a third special rapporteur, I think next year or in 2 years. So to create a mandate for a special rapporteur for the promotion of the right to know, justice, reparation, and the guarantee of non-recurrence. And this is this immense, not to be repeated title. But anyway, that was reflecting the so-called Joannet principle. I say it also for our assistants. It has a history, notably after you spoke about 3 decades, 4 decades. What we know is that transitional justice has a long road and a long journey to come. And I think that Joannet offered us some very interesting tools. So as we have seen the normative aspects, I would say, I would come back to the working hypothesis at this moment, and it might help us to highlight where we are now. So the working hypothesis, there was a need in countries who had gone through an authoritarian regime or violent conflicts, etc., to create conditions for a broader, holistic, and sustainable approach. What does it mean? We meant not only a justice plus a little bit of truth, a little bit of reparation, or something like that. At the core of this, we thought there is an issue of political will for real, sustainable transformation towards a democratic peace. And it was at the core of this also was the integral satisfaction of victims. Beautiful world, but what is it? Well, I will talk about this later. And the full acknowledgement of what happened, plus the responsibility in multiple forms taken by perpetrators, individuals or collective, with the view to create conditions to prevent such terrible events to happen again. So, but there were also several critical issues, and it was exactly happening in these decades where we had a no end, a sinfín, as we would say in Spanish, of resolution, celebrating and anchoring these rights of victims, this other rights, and this element. So it was really the decades of victims' rights, I would say, and advancing also in accountability, understanding in terms of international justice. But we considered that it was not enough. So I would say it in a simple way like that. Several issues were critical at this time, and this is why we thought that we needed a special mechanism. So when societies decide to deal with past atrocities or past massive human rights or international humanitarian law violations, be it due to an armed conflict or the repression by an authoritarian regime, they simultaneously have to work on multiple agendas. So our question was how to impede that transitional justice would become another additional agenda. Because guess what? The very first one to be either sidelined or refused or disliked, even by my colleagues, ambassadors, because they didn't want to have a difficult discussion sometimes with authorities, was this one, transitional justice. It comes and goes. So how could we convert it into a central core support to the global transformative societal agenda, constructing rule of law, etc. So, and about the how, our question was, well, how could dealing with the past strategy, transitional justice strategies, contribute also to support the emergence of a new culture regarding citizens' rights, duties of states? How can it help also to draw a clear line between past behaviors? Look at the Balkans nowadays. Did it help everything that was done to draw a line to genocidal, cultural behaviors and violence? So it has to do also with culture and politics, exclusion, discrimination, corruption, lack of shared economical development, etc. So I was talking a lot with Louis Joannet in this time, and he really has been a kind of mentor for me. And I have to say that, and I will close with that, Natasha, not to be too long, but he had a profound understanding of what was needed after such violent periods, violence also of another nature in authoritarian regime. So he was thinking in terms of rebuilding a foundational ethos. And therefore, and as a consequence, to re-engineer a solid transition in the societies towards a durable, participatory, peaceful democracy and solid rule of law. It was not only a normative horizon, but also a very political agenda. And we are still far away from that vision. We always fall down into what we know, which is merely technical. So I would like to tackle maybe 3 points as question where I think we have advanced, but not enough. Satisfaction of victim. What do we understand by satisfaction of victim? How are they involved in that? I think we have many more participatory elements, but how can we make sure that in these very distinct and different societies with different archaeological histories of conflict, how can we make sure that any transitional justice strategy be shaped in such satisfaction of the majority of victims? How are they involved in this process? Same question with perpetrators. How can we ensure that perpetrators, be it collective or individuals, can really fully acknowledge the facts on one hand? Yes, this happened, and we have all these informations, but also take responsibility in such a way, and I'm here not only talking about criminal accountability, take responsibility in such a way that first, it's a satisfaction for victims. They feel it's okay, I can leave this like that, but in such a way that this institution and these people will not repeat such a crime. As a conclusion, Natasha, what I would say is that a central question, while we have made some progress, is while we are very equipped technically, normatively, we have thousands of norms and standards that we can implement. What we still do not know exactly is how to generate political will for dealing with the past that allows a real, genuine, nationally owned and sustainable process. And I'm happy to continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. And we already heard some achievements when it comes to, broadening the conceptual understanding, advancing normative on the normative level, the rights of victims and victim satisfaction, and probably also more what I heard was this new agenda, transformative agenda of being part of a holistic process in countries prone by conflict. So Habib Nassar is the director of policy and research at Impunity Watch in the Netherlands. He has a long time experience of supporting activists and human rights organizations, civil society organizations, specifically in the Middle East, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq. I'm really interested now listening to Mo and Pablo. What would be your perspective and experience, especially from this civil society perspective? What has changed, and what is probably also still critical?
Thank you very much, Natasha. First of all, thank you to the Berghof Foundation for inviting us to this first event, if I understand correctly, of the Transitional Justice Hub. So it's an honor really to be part of that event, but also to joining a panel of so distinguished speakers, but more importantly, friends from which I learned a lot when it comes to transitional justice, but other fields too. So so Pablo and Mo emphasized very much some of the achievements that have been made in this past few decades. I would say since we have started to talk about transitional justice. What I would like really, to look at is also the actors involved in these processes and how they have shaped really the field over the years. I believe today the field of transitional justice is in crisis, but for me it's a creative crisis that is full of opportunities. Obviously, the international context, the rising nationalism, the spread of fascist-inspired ideas everywhere is not obviously a friendly environment for transitional justice. We saw just a few weeks ago, I mean, an elected far-right MP opening the first session of the newly elected French Parliament, who was expressing nostalgia for France's colonization of Algeria. We are seeing legislation promoting denialism flourishing in Eastern Europe, for example, which in countries that have really faced the most horrific crimes and systematic repression. I'm not going to talk about the dozens of decisions taken by the US Supreme Court in this past 10 days, because I think you have all heard about them. Obviously, the decision that depriving women from the right to abortion, the right to bodily integrity, actually has shocked everyone, to the point that many haven't seen that there were also many other decisions that have fundamentally undermined rights in the US, and I'm not going to talk about that because this is not our topic today. But so this environment is certainly undermining the fundamentals of transitional justice, such as justice, accountability, recognition, acknowledgement, and so on. But also there are other factors that are, I would say, undermining the field, and Mo has already touched upon some of this issues, such as the big emphasis on the technicalities, and which have to some extent been done to the detriment of the political dimension of transitional justice. What we have also seen, and here is where I get to the actors, is this booming transitional justice industry at the global level, with a plethora of actors involved in the field, most of them based, I would say, in Western countries, in the global North, but operating in the global South, and to some extent taking over the space from the local actors and from the grassroots organizations. So I think this has been pretty problematic for the field, to see a lot of the resources being based in the global North, when there are many needs also in the global South, and this doesn't mean that there are no needs in the global North. There are many needs in the area of dealing with the past. It's just that they are ignored, as simple as that. So the transitional justice industry has kind of taken control of the field, I would say, over the past 2 decades, and this has kind of marginalized the affected community, local policymakers, grassroots movements, and so on. But what I have noticed lately, and this is what gives me some hope, is that the industry in itself is in crisis, and I see an opportunity there. It is in crisis because it has become a sort of irrelevant for many of the affected communities, and I'm going to talk more in detail about this, but later on in this conversation. But this industry, which obviously is composed, I mean, by UN agencies, by international NGOs, by donors, by member states, and so on, has, for example, in a country like Tunisia, they have been all over the place. I mean, when the process started, and has kind of demobilized the local grassroots movements, the victims themselves, and so on. And this has had a detrimental effect on the process per se, which I'm not going to talk about right now, maybe later. But today we are seeing the grassroots reclaiming the justice space, and this change has followed or has been carried by many of the social and grassroots movement that have been very vocal in this past few years. I mean, the uprising, I mean, the Black Lives Matter movement, uprisings in countries like Chile, in Iraq, in Lebanon. This have a little bit changed the dynamic, and we are seeing a sort of a more combative transitional justice approach developing, the use of transitional justice as a form of resistance. I'm stopping here, but I would be happy to develop more.
Thank you, Habib, and I think it's really important not only to highlight the achievements and the changes, but also to highlight what is critical today. And I think talking about space and participation is really crucial when we look to the future. So, but before doing this, we move ahead and just I think Johanna indicated that we have one question with regard to guarantees on non-recurrence, right?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Natasha. Indeed, there was a question posted by a participant on the conceptual framework. I think it probably was in relation to Pablo's first input on the doctrinal developments. And the question, I think, is rather relevant to treat it right at the beginning, but maybe will also come up again later. That is, why do we actually speak of guarantees of non-recurrence, whereas in the other three pillars we speak of rights? So why has this been framed differently? I was thinking that maybe you want to quickly talk about this now. And we now also have a second comment, which maybe I already mentioned now here, and Mo, you could take it up in one of your upcoming reflections, which is how we can actually include traditional justice mechanisms and traditional leaders to promote a non-recurrence culture. So also very interesting forward-looking question. Thank you.
Thank you. Pablo, would you go ahead with the rights? And okay.
Yeah, thank you, Johanna, and thanks for the question, which I think is perfectly appropriate. There is a sense in which there is a sort of category mistake in the grouping of rights to truth, justice, reparations, and then guarantees of non-recurrence. Guarantees of non-recurrence is a much broader notion, which in fact doesn't refer to a measure, but to a function that can be satisfied by multiple measures. So it doesn't, criminal justice refers to a particular measure, which is very familiar in terms of the apparatus of the criminal justice system. Truth, of course, refers to a very well-known mechanism and its ancillaries. Guarantees of non-recurrence is much broader. Now, I think that the sense of the question picks on the difference between a guarantee and a right. And I think that that's a very perceptive difference. Part of the difficulty has to do with the fact that the vocabulary of guarantees of non-recurrence is not sufficiently developed as a matter of doctrine, although it is quite developed as a matter of practice. Guarantees of non-recurrence as a concept is used in about 6 United Nations documents. Granted, important, but important mostly for people like us. If you talk broadly within the system about guarantees of non-recurrence, Very few people know what this is about. It was adopted as a term by the Inter-American System of Human Rights, of both the Commission and the court uses the notion. But I think that the best way of thinking about this is in terms of prevention. Now, part of the difficulty with the discourse about prevention at the international level is that it focuses on what I take to be the wrong topics. Namely, it is very crisis oriented. And from my perspective, that means that it comes far too late. It focuses on the role of the international community, whereas in my opinion, most of the everyday effective preventive work is done at the national level by national institutions and with the great encouragement and support of civil society organizations. And because of this double reductionism in the international discourse about prevention, the focus on the role of the international community and the focus on crisis prevention, it awakens all sorts of apprehensions on the part of member states who often think that the discourse about prevention is a backdoor way of opening policy making to international intervention. I think that the future of transitional justice, to cut to the chase, depends on emphasizing the notion of prevention, but a notion of prevention that is comprehensive, that includes not just technological fixes, that doesn't exclude the very important preventive role of civil society organizations, and that, as Mo mentioned in the past, includes both political, cultural, and personal dimensions. This is what a comprehensive prevention policy would look like. In a moment in which the discourse of human rights is a bit losing its traction, to put it mildly, I think that recovering the sense in which human rights are not just exposed redress mechanisms, but also preventive anti-grievance mechanisms is absolutely fundamental. So I thank for the opportunity to talk about a topic that is dear to my heart and on which I think the future of transitional justice largely depends.
Thanks. Mo also wanted to react. I just have a quick look to our time. I think we then move forward with, where do we stand? What are the challenges? Some are already mentioned, so please, Mo, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's already part of the next logs, right? The guarantee of non-recurrence and this traditional justice mechanism is a kind of bridge to the next point. Well, I would, of course, agreeing with my longtime friend Pablo. We know each other since several decades, and I would say, again, coming back to Louis Joinet, because more and more I'm thinking of him and the conversations we had. He told me when, okay, the right to truth, etc., this was already a kind of normative development that was there, was very tangible. But he told me he had no better word than this one to insist on the fact that there was a need of a transformation, a holistic, a societal transformation, where on the level of normative, structural, cultural, institutional, right? He was touching upon new constitution, he was touching upon new laws, new institution. Remember, in this moment, he was also saying, well, you arrive in Timor-Leste and there is only one lawyer. So how can you make transitional justice with one lawyer and no organization, you know, of victims and etc. So what he was thinking, I believe, was a framework. So this is but I think a sentence that we should keep, because there is no guarantee, there are no guarantees, but what do we want to say? We want to say that at the end, the results, the expected result of transitional justice should be processes, should be a society in which there is a normative framework that protects every citizen. So it's the fully embodiment of the duties of states taken seriously, and states have the duty to prevent further violations. So in that sense, you know, we cross the bridge. So these are institutions, norms and standards, structures, and this touches, of course, cultural, economic, and social rights, and not only political and civil rights, which were very much related to authoritarian regimes, remember? So the cultural, economic, and social rights that are considered sometimes as second are actually at the very core of this reflection. So it's a whole of society, and in that sense, for the ones of you participants who are also working with this, you know, triangle from Galtung. So it's really structural, cultural, and inter-individual. And I think it helps us shaping a kind of preventive lens into transitional justice when we begin to launch it. And last, and it's really, I will not speak then about the second question, or maybe later, it's regarding traditional justice mechanisms, precisely when we have an approach like this, to say every society is different, the archaeology of every conflict or authoritarian regime is different, the values and the strengths of each society are different. This is why transitional justice as a technical toolbox doesn't work, because it's a process that needs to be embedded in a very bottom-up, horizontal participation, and Habib knows so much about that, because you have places in which victims will feel a full satisfaction. If, for example, and that's a case that is ongoing now, the perpetrator will come and live in their community to rebuild houses. Why? And I quote here an exact quote from victims of a massacre. They say, this guy, rather than going into jail, where he will live with his peers and will engineer other crimes, he better should live with us. Rebuild the house, the schools that he destroyed with us, because by living with us, he will recognize us as human beings. And therefore, it will be impossible for him to perpetrate such crime, because for him, we were just a target. So I find that's a beautiful example of what could an immaterial guarantee of non-repetition would be, to take it in another element that would not be. And in that sense, the traditional justice system, sometimes you have to pay attention with the huge machismo and, you know, traditional oppressive culture too. Let's not be too, you know, but all the, I would say, the values and assets that are existing and ethical practices that are existing in society should speak and reveal themselves, because they are, I think, crucial to the sustainability of these processes.
Thank you, Mo, but I would still stop for a moment and look into challenges. I think we do have different elements now already identified, especially when it comes to, you know, really put into value the culture processes, participation, rethink also the issue of, you know, prosecution and the role of offenders and perpetrators. But I would like to look to Habib, and, you know, especially coming to also one of the challenge we are probably also facing, not only in Syria and Iraq, but also, well, in Mali, Ukraine, is basically what kind of space can be created for different approaches on a local level to address, on the one hand, human rights abuses, but also, of course, thinking about protection and redress. So when we are looking to challenges, what is your experience and what would you highlight also to look at in the coming years, you know, when it comes to transitional justice? What would be the main challenges from your experience and perspective?
Yeah, thank you very much, all. I think you have put your finger on a very important issue, which is the issue of space. What kind of space we can or we need to create in order precisely to unleash this different, I would say, local energies, but also these different understandings and approaches to justice. And I like very much that Mo does remind us very often of the Joannet principles, I think, which are at the basis of transitional justice and are a framework that really does allow for the creation of these local spaces, and also to take on board many understanding of transitional justice, but also a range of rights that are not only the civil and political rights, but also economic and social and cultural rights. And Pablo has emphasized that prevention may be one door also towards really upholding a broader range of rights and really not focusing only on violations of civil and political rights. But I think that the question of space is essential. And I was talking about Tunisia when I spoke first, because really on paper, probably Tunisia did everything by the book, and every single international actor working in transitional justice was involved there. And I was actually, through these international actors, also involved in the process there. So when I speak about the international industry, it's not really to demonize international actors, because I've been working with them for probably the past 20 years of my career, but it's really to try to trigger some self-reflection on what we have been doing. And in Tunisia, all these actors came when the country was still really fragile. They were in the country maybe less than 2 weeks after the fall of the dictator, preaching all sorts of models for transitional justice and nice plans and so on, and which left very little space for the locals really to take ownership of their own process, and they started to do things as they were being taught to do things, and this really cut any sort of creativity. But also often the internationals don't have the sensitivity or the knowledge of the context to understand the different complexities that needs to be addressed. So the result is that the process went on. It was very much geared towards satisfying international actors, funding actually the process. But there was very little done really to reach out to the society at large, to mobilize civil society, to go outside of the capital and talk to the people who were affected by the dictatorship, but not only by the repression of political rights, but also by economic and social policies that contributed to the marginalization of entire regions in the interior of the country. So this did not happen because precisely the approaches were looking at transitional justice as very much only being done through institutions and formal institutions. So there was very little attention given to maybe forms of traditional justice. And when we say traditional justice, I see a broad range of tools here. It doesn't necessarily mean tribal forms of justice. I mean, because tribal forms of justice can be problematic in some contexts, and we have also to recognize that. But it's also means civil society-led initiatives, informal initiatives. It means giving the affected communities and victims the tools to mobilize, because already by being active and by themselves carrying, I mean, their own demands, their own justice agenda, this is already a form of justice, because in this process they do recover their political agency that the perpetrators have tried to erase. So it is very important, one, not to look at justice through institutions only. Of course, institutions are very important. I'm not saying that they are not, but also through informal forms of justice. But what I would also add is also it's the need to broaden the understanding of justice. So it needs now to encompass new forms, or not new forms of justice, but it cannot be just limited to retributive justice or restorative justice. I think that the notion of distributive justice is today very important. And I will finish with this example so I don't take too much time. In Chile, for example, and there is a very interesting article in the upcoming issue of the International Journal of Transitional Justice that talks about that, is that the conception of justice has really gone from something very centered on retributive, restorative justice to some extent, which has not satisfied really the younger generation there, and the ones who went down to the streets in 2019. And we are seeing a new discourse being pushed forward of distributive justice that is very much now a part of the constitution making process that is going on in Chile. And I think this is really very important. One, because it emphasizes, of course, the role of the youth. I think this is key, and they are often also marginalized and not taken into account. It's emphasized the need to broaden the understanding of justice beyond retributive or even restorative only. And it also emphasized the fact that transitional justice is not only done through a truth commission or a court or a reparations program, but it has to be mainstreamed into every other political process, and this example shows us that constitution building or constitutional making can also be a venue to push forms of justice.
Thank you, Habib. So we will surely come back to the issue of, what moves us forward, role of youth, constitution-making processes. I'll come back to the issue of what are the highlights, your recommendations to move forward in a minute. But I would like to ask Pablo and also Mo, just to, from your experience, but also looking to current protracted conflicts, Colombia or Ukraine, what would you define besides this, the foundation of transitional justice and human rights under pressure? What would be your, what would be the main challenges you identify for the near future? Pablo, will you start?
Thank you, Natasha. So Habib and Mo have already said a lot. Let me summarize the points in this way. I think that the transitional justice and justice-related work in general faces three general and global challenges. One is the continued selectivity in the implementation of international legal obligations. The recent wave of support for accountability in Ukraine, which of course I am very happy to see and totally committed as a member of the Commission of Inquiry to take full advantage of. But this is not a bad point to realize that we do not see the same sort of enthusiasm for accountability across the globe. And I'm not talking just about cases like Sudan or the CAR or Mali. I am talking about the fact that some of the northern countries that are so enthusiastic about accountability in Ukraine are more than lukewarm with respect to accountability concerning crimes that they themselves may have committed. And of course, this makes transitional justice work extraordinarily difficult. The second general challenge is the securitization of many topics that need not be dealt with from a security perspective, from the perspective of exceptional regimes, but that could be addressed through different mechanisms, but that are increasingly dealt with as security issues. The counterterrorism policy globally, I think, has had some pretty questionable consequences with respect to the respect of human rights globally. And of course, and I will not extend on this because all of us understand it, the closing of civil space almost universally makes transitional justice and human rights work globally very difficult. But those are general challenges. I think that there's one challenge in particular about transitional justice that I would like to focus on, and that is, I will do so by appealing to a term that organizational sociologists and economists frequently use, which is isomorphic mimicry. The tendency to think that the very same institutional formation will work equally well regardless of circumstances affects transitional justice very, very deeply. So the question that most transitional justice activists now ask themselves is, what is the most effective way of establishing a truth commission? What is the most effective way of establishing a prosecutorial mechanism? Instead of thinking about what is the most effective way of satisfying the relevant rights, we focus too much on the technical aspects of institution building, and we do not pay enough attention to the broader conditions under which rights can be said to be fully satisfied. In a sense, and I will finish with this, I think that I agree with Habib that the field is in a crisis, but in a crisis that is full of possibilities. And that the enthusiasm, the newfound enthusiasm for accountability sparked by the Ukrainian crisis is not a bad opportunity, first, to reassert the importance of accountability in general, but secondly, to make full use of a lesson that we learned through transitional justice precisely, namely that accountability should not be reduced to criminal accountability, but that it is a much broader notion that includes everything that we have been talking about, and crucially, the recovery of agency on the part of victims, and something That has never happened in any country that I ever visited. And that, of course, as you may recall, during my mandate included northern countries, not just countries in the global south. But I don't know of any country that has fully internalized the notion of the rights holder. When push comes to shove, governments are prone to think that their grace is the most important, their grace and their preservation in power, of course, is the most important thing to protect.
Thank you. Mo, your 3 challenges before looking to the future.
Yeah, in echo with Pablo, I would say what is relevant to enable, to satisfy citizen rights, what is relevant, and what is relevant to enable state to promote and protect these rights. So these 2 elements are indispensable, right, in this equation. So I think in order to insist about the challenging times we are living, where hate speech is spreading, fascist ideas, exclusion, and you name it, I won't make the list now. We are also taken into this ideological divisions at multilateral level. Pablo spoke about it regarding Ukraine. Investigate their crimes, not mine, to say it simply. So we are also, and let's face it, we are in a constant danger of instrumentalization. And this is not only the case with transitional justice, this is the case with all these issues where at the centers you have rights, and at the center you have duties of state that they wish or do not wish to implement and take on seriously. The same is with prevention, same with prevention. So that's the equation, that's the corner place where we can move or we can't move. Where do we go from there? So my first question would be, and recommendation same time, is what would transitional justice look like? And we have understood, and I think the 3 of us, we think the same, transitional justice is a kind of part of a national agenda, not only an isolated process by itself. No, it should be integrated in the national agenda, in the national budget as much as possible, as an ongoing agenda, because it's about making the state capable to promote and protect rights, and it's about citizens to enjoy their rights, right? So in this post-conflict, etc., it's complicated, all these elements are playing together. So transitional justice is a mainstream agenda. And what if prevention would guide that? Namely, the simple question to say, okay, what in a preventive manner, what will be the expected result of a transitional justice in terms of quality of state, to answer, in terms of distributive justice, in terms of culture, in terms of norms and standards, in terms of values, in terms of integration, in terms of constructive management of diversity, which is a core indicator of prevention. Second challenge is, how do we generate political will? How is it that we do this? We don't know yet. We have a lot of ideas, mobilization, etc. I know that, again, as Habib was underlining, we cannot do it without a bottom-up pressure, the so-called pressure from below. But that's one thing which leads to advocacy, fighting for rights, etc. But we need an adhesion, and we need a political agreement of parties, be it in mediation process of government, to understand that it's for their own good and for their own survival as government, as state, and as society, that they can/need to enter in that. So how do we involve them in this sense with these 2 sentences? How can we, what is relevant to enable and satisfy citizens' rights and human rights in a holistic manner, and what is relevant to enable states to promote and protect these rights? And this is where we have to meet them. And the last point for me is basically after this cohort of technical experts, transitional justice industry that Habib was talking about, I believe that in these hard times and complex times, we more and more should transform ourselves in facilitators of process where the national actors can access through us if necessary, but often they can now access directly these industries in the media and all that, to facilitate these conversations between victims group who are opposed along the lines of perpetrators, civil society and victim groups, where civil society groups often tend to speak in the name of victims instead of letting victims speak, civil society groups with civil servants to talk together about, okay, we know all this, how could these technical ideas and this political decision transform into a governmental planning? Right? So this is, and my last point would be about mediation process. Remember, guys, that through these 3 decades, we went from mediators who would say, I don't want to hear anything about that, to now the UN saying, we will not endorse any peace agreement where the issue of accountability, satisfaction of victims, reparation, etc., will not be inserted. Now, there are many ways to do it, but that's already a very important threshold. So how do we accompany before, during, and after a conversation about that, that really enables a society not to think in terms of retaliation, because it has not been enough, but what can my role be wherever I am in this framework? Sorry, I was too long. I see that.
Well, thank you very much. And I think I would now tell the audience that you unfortunately have to leave right on time. But we take your thoughts and recommendations with us, and probably, not probably, for sure, we'll continue our discussions and thinking. Thanks a lot for joining us.
And everyone, thank you so much. Sorry to leave. Thank you for the invitation. Bye-bye.
Bye. Voila, and now we have some time to, first of all, look into the future again, and I would be curious to hear some very concrete, probably recommendations for us to continue when we think about transforming transitional justice. And after your thoughts, we will open for some questions and comments in the chat. Pablo?
Yeah, so one comment, and Habib, I will refer to your use of the transitional justice industry, not critically, because I understand exactly the way that you meant it. But I think that it is important to keep in mind that there is nothing peculiar about the way the trajectory that transitional justice has traveled in terms of its formalization. So all fields go through similar processes, and part of the process of consolidating a field, especially in the rapid manner in which transitional justice has consolidated itself, involves a moment of differentiation. So what's the difference between us and them? In the case of transitional justice, to simplify, it was, we do not only do human rights advocacy in the classical way, we include other elements like, for example, truth, reparations, and we care about guarantees of non-recurrence. So we have a sort of holistic approach to this. And this is what differentiates us from earlier human rights efforts. That has been accompanied by huge processes of formalization, the creation of master's programs, PhD programs, the establishment of not just one, but two specialized journals. I mean, all of us participate in this process of formalizing the field, which explains why the learning curve in new cases is so steep. So I went to Colombia to give advice to the Ministry of Justice in 2003, when the transitional justice was first being discussed. By 2006, there was nothing that the international community could teach Colombia about transitional justice, because they had mastered the field. And of course, now I am absolutely sure that Colombia will become a net exporter of expertise now that it is close to finishing some of its processes. So again, there's nothing peculiar about that. The next stage after a field is differentiated is that once again, it opens itself up to connections with others. And one sees this in all sorts of disciplines. And I think that this is where we should be moving towards and trying actively to pursue. Not to colonize other fields, but to clarify what the linkage is between transitional justice and other fields that are crucial in the context where we work: security, development, and others, how we can link with one another in order to make increasingly coherent, increasingly strong links between what we do and what others do. We haven't mentioned technology, and I think that this is one crucial area in which the field will also have to accommodate what some people call the fact that we are living in a post-truth era. Truth commissions are now operating in an area in which there is social media, in which there is a great deal of disinformation. So, for example, they have never had to really grapple with questions about digital forensics in a way in which I foresee that truth commissions in the future are going to have to address. But again, and I will finish with this, I think that the future will depend a lot on how those linkages that I was talking about with other adjacent areas are articulated in a way that doesn't merely redress past violations, but tries to prevent the occurrence of new ones. I think that this is absolutely fundamental.
Thank you, Pablo. Habib?
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to go back to what Mo said towards the end, and it's unfortunate that she couldn't stay. This role of facilitator. She talked about the role of facilitator because, again, I wasn't really criticizing the international organization or the field as it has developed, because in some ways it did develop that way spontaneously. But I also think that we should try to address the downsides of how it has developed into a very technical industry that is kind of concentrating a lot of the resources that should go to transitional justice, but also a lot of the knowledge. And since you have invited us to this event as the first event of the Transitional Justice Hub, what I would say, first of all, in terms of knowledge, because knowledge sharing is essential, and but it's a lot of the knowledge that is being taken into account so far. But this is changing, and this is obviously changing. A lot of the programs that Pablo mentioned are based in Western countries. This is how it happened. I'm not going to go over it and try to explain why. But now I feel that there is one, a need to incorporate in every knowledge sharing project all the knowledge that is being created, generally speaking, in the Global South, but also at the grassroots level, which is not an academic knowledge. It is not sort of policymakers produced knowledge. It is a lot of experience being developed, I mean, by local actors to deal with very specific, concrete problems. And here, based on my experience, I've noticed that when we support activities such as peer-to-peer exchanges, like we bring together victim activists from one context into another, and the message and the learning is much more efficient and powerful, because you have also to add to it the solidarity that starts building up, which is also pretty interesting. So I think that this knowledge produced at the grassroots level has to be taken into account, and I would encourage you as a hub, a TJ hub, to take it into account. There are many ways to do it. I'm not going to talk about it right now. The other probably recommendation I would have is a better redistribution of the resources, because again, in a lot of the resources that are being allocated to transitional justice, remain in one specific region. Again, if you take a country like Tunisia, and sorry to go back to Tunisia all the time, but it's pretty interesting example. It's a lot of the funds allocated to support the process were allocated actually to international actors. So very little of it remained in the country, because they deploy their staff there and then they repatriate them and they leave very little resources for the locals really to have the means and the tools to also be able to address their own challenges, to be creative, to develop their own solutions. So I really think that there is a need to reflect on the allocation and redistribution of resources, and see how to make sure that the grassroots and the locals benefit more from the millions being spent on it. And again, I mean, one quick point, because Pablo said, yeah, the field developed as every other field. That's very true, because also if you take the broader field of human rights, it has developed the exact same way, and it is suffering from the exact same problem. So, of course, we can take a lot out of it. I mean, and Pablo did name all of the research being produced, the journals and so on. This is all fantastic and great. But I think now it's time to reflect on the redistribution of resources and on the role of international also actors, more as facilitators than as the ones being parachuted in a context and starting providing technical advice. I see this because I myself have used all this terminology and I stop here.
Thank you, Habib. So yeah, I think it's really important to not only think about, norms and approaches and really issues of how to transform, but being aware of the fact that it always comes with resources. That's very clear. So for the last, let's say 3, 5 to 4 minutes, we would take probably 1, 2 questions and comments from the participants, and I would ask Johanna.
Sure. Yeah, there has been a couple of comments and questions now touching upon different aspects that have been discussed. I'm just going through them also to give them some visibility and value now, and you can, I think, see how you address them in your final comments. I think one comment related to what Habib just mentioned, also the importance of giving credit to indigenous or local knowledge and experiences. Really the question how we can learn from indigenous processes and indigenous forms of healing and move away from more like neo-colonial or even Western dominated understandings of how these processes should look like. And then there was a more skeptical comment on the international arena, and something you alluded to at the very beginning, I think Pablo and the others, in relation to changing political climate, and also what we're seeing, the continuous difficulties in actually enforcing international human rights standards, which has always been, of course, a kind of a critical element. And here the question, do you see any improvements regarding also the positioning of Western or international powers like the US and others with regard to the field of transitional justice? Probably we already touched upon this bit when you made the comparison with the current discourse on Ukraine, but maybe you can have a look at the role of international actors again, and their commitment, relative commitment to the field. And then there was a question relating to the linkages between transitional justice and peace building and mediation efforts, and looking also at the resistance that we sometimes may find in that field to include transitional justice aspects in the ongoing peace process and mediation effort, and whether you would be able to point out to any successful examples where transitional justice actually consolidated mediation efforts and peace processes. So I think that's for the comments, and I would maybe like to mention one last point from a colleague from the Ministry of Justice in Kosovo, who was also talking, explaining in the chat that the ministry is currently in the process of drafting a transitional justice strategy. Which the question here would be in this context, whether you think that the field has maybe not paid enough attention to the aspect of education and knowledge about transitional justice goals and concepts, also as a means of guarantees of non-recurrence. And also whether you think, and that's very concrete, I think, linked to the Kosovo case, whether what kind of effects or challenges you may see in terms of establishing a transitional justice mechanism after a long time after the political transition, what your position would be on that. I'm stopping here and giving back to you, Natasha. Thank you for everyone who commented.
Thanks, because it also shows, the broad variety of questions and challenges we are facing today. But we also have the challenge of time right now. So I would probably ask you to pick one of the question, each of you, and also connect it to your, let's say, final thought and idea. Who would like? Oh, okay, Pablo is going to start. Great, thanks.
So thanks, and of course this is an impossible challenge, but in hoping that this is not too cryptic. In the end, transitional justice has to contribute to the problem of social integration. We need to be able to live with one another. And one dimension of that project has always been institutional, at least since the times of modernity. But that is not to say that social integration can be reduced to social engineering. It's not a question of a clever institutional design. Education is an important element of this, but so are many, many others. Economic opportunities, the lack of class and other segmentations, the feeling that we are part of a shared political project has to be given reality, and that is given reality through institutional means, through cultural means, through economic means, and also in terms of the cultivation of certain personal dispositions, tolerance, solidarity, etc. And part of what we, I think, need to do as a project right now in the transitional justice arena is to overcome the adolescent tendency that we can do everything on our own, to the more mature attitude that we need to work in concert with others in order to create coherent programs that are inclusive, that listen better to the others, and that do some of the things that we have been talking about, again, with the aim of contributing to the idea of social integration around the notion of the rights holder who is capable fearlessly to raise claims against others and against institutions, and who is listened to because he or she is considered to be part of an equally shared political project. That's my final thought.
Thank you. Habib.
Yes, thank you. It's indeed a challenge, and many very good comments. I didn't register all the questions, so maybe I'll finish with trying first to respond to the question from the gentleman from Kosovo, I think from the Ministry of Justice, if I'm not mistaken, about the time to establish a transitional justice mechanism. Obviously, I think that there is probably no right time to do it. I mean, because sometimes when it happens right after the conflict, maybe the society, the different actors are not necessarily mature enough really to handle such a mechanism, or there are risks of such a mechanism being controlled and dominated by the victors, and it would be victor's justice. And whereas one waits maybe a little bit more for the country to make progress in its transition and stabilize and start really looking at solution, at transitional justice institutions, it could be better, but also it really depends on what institution we are talking about. Also, I mean, because what applies to courts, say, or a truth commission, doesn't necessarily apply to a reparations program or to, I would say, mechanism, for example, to deal with the issue of the disappeared, because in this both cases, I mean, victims cannot wait endlessly to get answers. So really, it's difficult to give a general answer. But what I would say at the end, I very much agree with Pablo on the idea of really putting the rights holder at the center of these processes, and not only as, I would say, individuals also, but as societies and communities affected by violations. Because, for example, if we're talking about cultural rights, they do have a collective dimension, and they cannot be addressed individually. And this is also true for other rights. I'm not going to develop this idea right now, but really to conclude, I think that, and I hope, I mean, that next time we would have some more grassroots voices around the table, because to some extent, I feel that I'm talking on their behalf, and again, it's kind of hijacking their voice. So this is probably my recommendation for next time, because I'm no longer, maybe at some point in my life and career, I was a grassroots activist, but I haven't been for maybe 20 years. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Habib. And I think it's well, we would have loved to do it in present with really people being able to discuss and interact. We very much hope it will be possible in autumn, probably, we will see. What I take for our question, what's next for transitional justice and how to transform it, what I heard was basically how to create the political will on the national level. It's about space and resources, obviously. It's about a transformative national agenda, which is linked to many different fields. So those are the very, small highlights I'm taking with me right now. Thanks a lot again. And as I already said, this is one of our first dialogue events. We will for sure have other opportunities to follow up this discussion. We will record it and we will write down some of the main insights and experiences you have shared with us. Thanks a lot. Have a nice afternoon and a nice evening.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thanks. Bye.